we are going to go immediately to $1 million Bitcoin.
You know, you're a convertible bond expert, and it seems like just how crazy is this phenomenon that Michael Saylor has unlocked?
I was getting calls from so many different hedge fund managers. What is going on? Why is it behaving like this? What's happening? I mean, I was at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville. You had MicroStrategy, Semler, and I remember thinking to myself, they'll probably have 10 companies on there next year. I mean, we're at 70. That moment really was, in my opinion, the inflection point. I think that the US has less Bitcoin than China. My view is that they want to reaccumulate, get back above China again before announcing anything. If you can get the boomer generation over this sort of problem that they have mentally around.
Bing bong. We are back with another edition of the State of Bitcoin podcast, where I've got the man, the myth, the legend, Richard Byworth in the house here. But Richard, I heard on a previous podcast you discussing MicroStrategy on how much Bitcoin that Michael Saylor is buying, and it could cause the coveted short squeeze with all of these corporations coming on. So I wanted to get you on here to discuss this. Do you think that we're going to see a short squeeze as we're racing on past 100K as we're recording this?
Yeah, look, Brandon, I think we're already going. I was going to post the other night, just before we popped, that I think I just had that feeling that we're about to cross the chasm. David Bailey posted that, you know, this is the last time you're going to see 5-digit Bitcoin. I completely agree with him. I think it's now gone. This was a beautiful gift when we drew back down towards 75K. You've now got 70 Bitcoin corporations across the world, from the UK to Paris, to over in the US. So, I mean, there's just a lot of focus on this, and that's grown in the last year. I mean, I was at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville. You had MicroStrategy, Semler, and MetaPlanet on the same stage. And I remember thinking to myself, they'll probably have 10 companies on there next year. I mean, we're at 70. So that's the sort of scaling of growth that we've seen. So, you know, you look at the buying of the ETFs, you combine it with the buying of the corporate treasuries. On top of that, we don't really know what the sovereigns are doing. They're never going to tell you, right? In the same way that a corporate that's listed needs to give some level of transparency. You're not going to get that from the governments. This is nation state game theory, and FOMO. And I think we could very quickly be at 200,000.
Yeah, and that's, I think, you know, you're not wrong there. It seems like all things are taking out. And there's another caveat here that I think recently has just kind of made itself available for the general public, and that's essentially being able to borrow on your Bitcoin, right? Like banks are starting to do it. Strike and Jack Mallers just allowed this. Do you think that this is going to be another player where essentially the average retail, even, you know, the whale, so to speak, currently, they don't have to sell their Bitcoin in order to get, you know, the USD back or whatever fiat they want to use in that current system? So essentially, the hodlers can just keep on hodling, and there might not be any Bitcoin left. Do you think that this is going to help accelerate, or do you think that that might be a little bit overblown?
No, look, I think the more that we see the whole financial landscape develop for Bitcoin, and Bitcoin lending is an extremely important part of that, it's only going to make adoption quicker and faster and higher. I think that you've got companies. I'm in Switzerland right now, and there are, I think, 4 banks in Switzerland that provide some level of lending on your Bitcoin collateral. The LTVs are low; they're sort of 10, 20%, but still, you know, if you've got 100 Bitcoin, you know, you can borrow $2 million. That's a meaningful amount of money for someone, and you know, obviously, there are some very big holders in Switzerland. And so people are starting to leverage that. And, you know, as you're implying, that will mean that Bitcoin will just move less and less.
Okay, so you've discovered Bitcoin and are on the path to financial self-sovereignty. But simply holding Bitcoin is not enough. You need to make sure that it's scored properly and you are in 100% control over all your assets. So sharing your keys with third parties and taking on that counterparty risk is not the answer. The answer is pure and simple. It's uncompromising self-custody, and there's no better way to do it than the Bitcoin way. They've got over 25 years of cybersecurity experience, and their team of experts can help you properly self-custody your Bitcoin, secure your digital life, configure your privacy phones, and even establish a Plan B residency if you're looking to do so. So I'm going to help you guys out here and give you a free consultation if you take the first step and visit thebitcoinway.com/green candle, and you can check out the boys at the Bitcoin Way and see how they can help you become self-sovereign. Yeah, 100%. And because Bitcoin is moving less and less, and it's kind of interesting, I want to dive into just what a MicroStrategy, now known as Strategy B, is doing, because you're a convertible bond expert, and it seems like Michael Saylor is using every single traditional financial tool underneath the sun to scoop up more and more Bitcoin.
Mhm.
So is it possible for this to keep going on? Because, if you look at the balance sheet, if I were to just at surface level tell you that this company has lost money for the past 4 years on every single earnings call, but they're basically one of the best performing stocks and traded at a, Mag 7 type of level, you'd tell me I'm absolutely crazy. So just how crazy is this phenomenon that Michael Saylor has unlocked?
Yeah, I think obviously he's now moved to fast B accounting, and so next quarter, I think he's marked at, or essentially going to be marked for the quarter close of March at about 84,000, where he closed December at 97,000, I want to say. So he obviously had a very negative quarter for the first quarter, but this quarter is going to be a very, very different quarter. And I think if you are someone that's just simplistically looking at the numbers and not really understanding the company, you're going to just be blown away next quarter. But I think, that's all a distraction. I think if you've paid attention to MicroStrategy, you understand that what they're doing is being accretively dilutive to the shareholder base and acquiring more Bitcoin. How has he turned the company from a $1 billion company to $100 billion company in just 5 years with it's 100x with only a 10x in Bitcoin over the period? And that's through all these yield generating strategies and these ways that he's managed to accretively dilute his shares to buy more Bitcoin. And this is part of understanding the whole thing. There's been a big amount of arguing on X recently about at what level he should stop selling into the MNAV to allow the MNAV to expand again. But I would counter that to say that the level of his MNAV multiple is defined by how aggressive he's being. You can't be $100 billion company and just quietly be accumulating, a few hundred Bitcoin here and there. Like, he has to go hard and he has to keep accumulating. And we are all going to be, as shareholders in MSTR, extremely happy once you see that complete rip in the Bitcoin price, because that is the thing that will drive the MNAV multiple combined with his level of aggression. Look at someone like Marathon, right? Their MNAV has dropped to almost 1. I think that's where they are today. And so they just haven't been aggressive enough, and the underlying business people are not so confident about. In fact, by having Bitcoin as a balance sheet trade, they're now valuing their entire business at 0. So it doesn't work unless you're being super aggressive and have a cash flow positive business, which obviously at this point, unfortunately, the Marathon is not. So that's the way to think about it. I think people just really get lost in the wood, lost trying to see the wood for the trees. And they don't understand that the reason that they've 100x their money in MicroStrategy is because of how aggressive Saylor has been. And he's had that first mover advantage, and he understands that now.
Well, I mean, I'm going to play devil's advocate with you because, of course, if you go on Twitter now, everybody, when Bitcoin is crashing, especially in the traditional financial world, is like, all right, now's the time. Strategy is going to default. Is there a place or a, situation where that actually happens? Or is it the way that, Saylor has kind of set it up that, he's kind of checked all boxes. So it would be extremely, extremely difficult for them to default at this point.
That's exactly right. I mean, you look at the requirements for funding that he has on his debt and on his perpetual equities. Basically, you've got the coupons on the preferred shares are paid, they're very high coupons, but he can pay them all in kind, which means he can just issue stock to pay those coupons. On the convertible bonds, the recent issues, obviously, he's been doing 0% coupons, which means there's no cash requirement until the put dates, right? So you have to look at the put date, which I think the first put date is mid 2027. So we're 2 years away from the first put on $1 billion convert. That's $1 billion of debt on a $100 billion company in 2 years' time. Where's his real LTV? Well, you have to calculate where his Bitcoin is at a 1 times MNAV, which is, I think $55 billion today, right? So that would imply on his $8 billion of debt, roughly, and I'm trying to do the maths in my head, a 13% LTV. So at a 13% LTV, he needs Bitcoin at 13,000, and he needs it to stay there for 2 years for him to actually have to really sell any Bitcoin, even if, and there will be other options open to him at that point anyway. So do you think 13,000 Bitcoin is going to happen in the next 2 years with everything that is going on? I think it's pretty unlikely.
I agree with you. 13,000 seems extremely low. And it just, obviously, we're sitting here recording it. We just hit back over 100K. So, we've got nation states starting to play out and all these other companies and corporations. I think we're recording this just as, Strategy World is going on or just finishing as well. So, how many more corporations do you think are going to start to come on to this as they're seeing it? Do you think like one of the big players, I know Meta is one I love to talk about because Mark Zuckerberg has majority voting power when it comes to there. And he's the only company with a larger market cap than Strategy right now that the CEO has majority of that voting power, and his goats are named Bitcoin and Maxi. So I always like to think he's a closet Bitcoiner, and that's going to happen soon. Do you see that happening where, we're going to start to see this wave of corporate adoption and, the next 6 to 7 months to the rest of 2025 is going to be absolutely bananas?
I don't know about Meta. He seems to have some gripe with the Winklevoss twins, and if Meta did adopt Bitcoin, then maybe he's vindictive enough that he wouldn't want to benefit the twins. I don't know. I don't know how the guy's mind works, but yeah, he does have that goat named Bitcoin, and someone recently suggested that Meta was the company that potentially would make the move, and I do agree with you on that unique positioning of Zuckerberg having that control that you don't see anywhere near the rest of the Mag 7. So it makes logical sense, but I also do think that he's a bit of a vindictive individual, and so perhaps he still holds a grudge against the twins, who I don't know if he still does. So we'll see. Nintendo have been rumored, and that makes a lot of sense to me. Got a large amount of cash on the balance sheet, and I think Japan generally is the land of zombie companies. I worked in Japan for a large proportion of my career, and the way that the Japan corporate society works is they don't really care too much about shareholders. Japanese corporates are more focused on making sure that they're a good employer and they benefit society, and these are all important attributes, but not necessarily beneficial to the shareholder. So you end up with these companies that limp along, don't make a huge amount of profit, but sometimes sit on a huge amount of cash. So doing something like adopting a Bitcoin standard when you've been watching Metaplanet, I think we just did the numbers on it because Simon's coming to speak at our summit next week. We just did the numbers. In the year that they completed, it's about 3,500% increase in the stock price. So, I think every corporate in Japan needs to be paying attention to that, and likely is. Why is this company that's been buying Bitcoin, that Bitcoin only went up 3x over the course of the last year? How did that happen? And I think that conversation will be happening in a number of boardrooms across Japan. So I really think that Japan will be a very interesting space to watch. And if you did see Nintendo, gosh, that would change everything, because Nintendo is a highly respected company in corporate Japan.
Yeah, I want to dive into your experience here in a second, but just a more open-ended question. Do you think that Wall Street has even figured out how to value these companies that are putting Bitcoin on the balance sheet?
It's a fantastic question, actually. And I've been thinking about this, because what is a better buy right now? Is it Marathon at a 1 times MNAV? Or is it Metaplanet at a 3 times MNAV? And I think the answer is very clearly Metaplanet. And that's because of 2 things. 1, they've demonstrated to the market that they're going to be aggressive. But 2, that MNAV actually allows them to be more accretive to the shareholder. So then you get into this funny paradigm where you go, okay, well, let's say GameStop go ahead and do $1.5 billion purchase. They're then suddenly sitting on an MNAV of, I don't know what the market cap of GameStop is. Let's say it's 10 billion, just for the sake of argument, and that they buy 1 billion of Bitcoin with their recent cash. So they're suddenly sitting on a 9 times MNAV, right? Or sorry, 10 times MNAV. And if Ryan Cohen and the team decided to suddenly be super aggressive and just do a massive ATM and combine that, like Strategy did with a CB issuance, then suddenly that would be a very, very aggressive company with a 10 times multiplier that could suddenly be super accretive. So again, that would somehow be even more interesting, certainly than a Strategy, and possibly even than a Metaplanet, because he's got a 10 times MNAV to just keep doing that whipsaw with. And so long as he's strategic around bringing in, new institutional investors, which there are a lot out there that want to be participating in creating a portfolio of these corporate treasuries in Bitcoin, he could be very, very effective very quickly. So to your question, I don't know the answer. I certainly don't think anyone in Wall Street who is sitting on the research desk has a very clear idea of how to value this MNAV, because from a cheapness perspective, 1 is obviously looking good, but on a accretive basis, you want that MNAV to be as high as possible. So it's a really hard question, and I definitely don't know the answer. I think someone way smarter than me will figure it out at some point. But yeah, it's really unclear at this point.
The best place to buy Bitcoin in the United States and Canada is the Bitcoin Well. You could go to the bitcoinwell.com/green candle and sign up today, and they will give you wishing well tokens. They are one of the only exchanges in the United States that will give you free sats every time you buy Bitcoin. You have a chance to win 1 million sats every time you buy. You get wishing well tokens. You flip the coin down the wishing well, and you have the chance to win 1 million sats. You heard me here, folks. 1 million sats. And on top of that, they have the absolute best over-the-counter service where you can make purchases over $50,000, and they will walk you through the whole thing. They have the best rates in the United States and in Canada. And on top of that, they have the best white glove service where they will take you through those giant purchases just so you feel comfortable. You'll get it in cold storage, and it's strictly non-custodial. They are saying, we want you to experience the true power of Bitcoin and that self-custody. So go to the well, Sign up bitcoinwell.com/green candle today. Enough from me, back to the show. Yeah, it's really interesting, especially the way you're lining it out, because to be honest, I don't even really think about like Marathon as a company to have Bitcoin on the balance sheet, just because they're quite frankly just not as aggressive as Strategy. And, I always kind of worry about the Bitcoin mining companies having exposure to Bitcoin, because I mean, what we saw in the last bull run was all of these mining companies kind of FOMOing into Bitcoin, even leveraging their miners and all these other, things in order to do that. And then a lot of them went belly up the last bull run, especially like during that crash. So I always think of them almost as like oil mining companies or gold mining companies, where they want to distance themselves from the volatility of the underlying asset, which is Bitcoin in this case. But if you're right with holding Bitcoin, obviously it would be just leaps and bounds better for the company. So seeing what Metaplanet, Strategy, all of these guys are doing is just a phenomenon that is absolutely insane. And you're lining out a lot of the debt products and the convertible notes that they are getting. What can you dive into a little bit more of just like how crazy this strategy is to keep accumulating more Bitcoin? Because it seems like the banks and the backing that Strategy has, the funding almost seems endless, where they're just going to keep being able to get more and more Bitcoin. Is there an end in sight with this, or do you think that every single time that basically Saylor's able to negotiate and get more Bitcoin per share, is I guess how the new metric might be looked at? Is there an end to this faucet of Saylor being able to buy more Bitcoin?
Well, the fixed income market is an absolute monster. We're talking trillions, hundreds of trillions of dollars. So this is why he's focused on the STRF and STRK products, is to try and find something that sticks in the fixed income markets. But obviously what's going to be important is people attributing a credit to MicroStrategy. So once he can get to the point of ingraining trust in some of these investors and showing that these products are working and being extremely generative compared to the other things that they have on their balance sheet, he's going to just keep growing further and further. And at some point, you're going to see credit rating agencies also go down the road of say, okay, we need to understand these companies. We see Bitcoin as the core collateral asset. So the conversation we had earlier, when Saylor's sitting on an LTV with zero cash requirements to fund and service the debt, so low, that's such a low LTV, they've got to look at it and say, okay, we can start to look at a better credit for this company. You'll start to see CDS markets develop, and that will just help all of this pervade and grow. And so Strategy, actually, yes, he has a lot more tools and potential to continue growing. I mean, he hasn't really tapped the whole of the equity market possibility either. I mean, right? If you're an equity allocator and you don't have Strategy in your portfolio, you're really underperforming now. And the more that he grows, the more that you have an obligation to make sure that that stock is in your portfolio. So he hasn't even got close to tapping out in the equity market, and let alone the bond market, which hasn't even started. So there's just so much more growth for him to make, and I really can't imagine that Strategy will be a much bigger company than we can imagine in the next year or even two.
Wow. So he's going to be able to unlock potentially trillions of dollars just to scoop up more Bitcoin. So I guess you got to get it fast. But you mentioned Japan, and I've heard you on other shows say that, you kind of cut your teeth in the Japanese market. And you mentioned Nintendo as well. Like, comparatively to Strategy, do the Japanese companies have as much access to capital as as maybe American publicly traded companies? Like, are all of these just like equally available across the world, or is there some limitations? And you talked about a lot of zombie companies. I want you to dive into a little bit about what you meant about that as well.
Well, the zombie companies I explained, it's less about necessarily being profitable and more about providing sustainable employment for, the salarymen that you and women that you have in Japan. This is changing through regulation changes that we saw in 2016, but you still have a number of these companies that aren't particularly exciting for any shareholder, but they just do a job of employing, right? And so they are funded by the banks at rates that they probably shouldn't be, and are continue to operate. That's sort of a very unique thing and slightly socialist thing about Japan's economy. As a result, the Japanese stock market is a lot smaller than US markets. I can't remember exactly, but I think it's probably around a tenth or maybe even a 20th of the size of the US markets, even though it's the second largest stock market in the world. And I think that, this is obviously an area where you've only got Metaplanet that are doing this properly currently. I think a couple of other Japanese companies have bought a bit of Bitcoin on their balance sheet, but they're certainly not operating as Bitcoin treasuries in the true sense of the word. So, there are thousands of companies in Japan, and they could all start to be looking at starting this. So I think that if you look at the size differential of the two markets versus the size differential of just MicroStrategy versus Metaplanet, then you can see that Metaplanet can do at least another 5x from here in terms of capital inflows. And international investors, they're not restricted on an institutional basis by trading in Japan. So, Japan has been sort of left alone because it's been a, fairly consistently underperforming market, with you always having to consider the weakness of the yen that's just sort of entrenched with the way that they structured the JGB market. And so, as a result, you end up with international investors avoiding it. But, this sort of injection to the arm or shot to the arm could be the thing that actually brings people back to Japan, and Japan becomes an enclave for Bitcoin corporate treasury companies. I could see that happening. There are a lot of companies that could benefit from this in Japan very quickly. And as I said, that regulation that was brought out in 2016 has led companies to have a bit more of a focus and need to be focused on shareholder outcomes. So, I think the wind is well positioned to be blowing in the favor of Japan.
Yeah, and it sounds like it as well. I mean, obviously, Metaplanet's one of the leaders in that space and would potentially have that similar strategy, first mover advantage just over in Japan comparatively. But it seems like, corporations and even countries globally and now are starting to flock away from the dollar and other fiat currencies and are, more flocking into the new system and trying to obtain as much Bitcoin as possible. Now, as this nation state FOMO kind of mixes in with this corporate FOMO, how do you see that playing out with, just the other currencies globally? Do you see that as, potentially causing some hyperinflation or just crashing other fiat currencies, just kind of seeing the current system crumble, I guess, beneath us while everybody is starting to shift over into the new system? Or is there another way you see that, I guess, somewhat playing out?
Look, I do agree with you that corporate treasury adoption is making people understand Bitcoin faster, or at least adopt Bitcoin faster. I don't want to live in a world where fiat currencies are collapsing. I think it won't be pretty. And I don't know if you read the ECB paper. I mean, that came out probably around 6 months ago. That basically it was a really weird paper because it started talking about how Bitcoin is going to succeed, and rather than recommending readers to buy Bitcoin, it said you should be doing everything to speak to your local representatives to make sure that this unfair situation of early adopters of Bitcoin is curtailed to some degree. And I mean, if you read that paper and that's what you think about doing, I mean, rather than buying Bitcoin, I think you need help. But it was a really weird paper to read as someone who is obviously a big advocate for Bitcoin. You're like, gosh, is that the way that they're going to try and tilt the narrative that, you know, Bitcoiners should be considered the bane of society and the reason that our system is failing, rather than obviously their own irresponsible printing of fiat currencies be the reason. But you know, this is what, you know, we know of the central banks. They're going to blame everybody but themselves for the ultimate demise of their system. So yeah, it could be a fairly hairy time to be a Bitcoiner, but you know, obviously focus on truth, focus on education. It should only help, and obviously the work you're doing is extremely important in making sure people understand that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But let's dive into a little bit about just the current economic situation, because, you know, as an American, everybody always thinks, you know, out here that the world revolves around us. But it seems like the financial world, obviously with the US dollar as the global reserve currency, it sort of does right now, right? But, you know, I think there's an interesting dichotomy that we're seeing where the president is just openly coming at Jerome Powell and the Fed saying, you need to cut interest rates. You need to cut interest rates. And globally, you know, we're seeing all these other central banks start to do that. And, you know, Powell is being resistant because inflation is still hot. Despite the numbers that they're putting out there, I think the American people and people globally are still feeling that. So, yeah, how do you feel about the overall economy and, you know, I guess the job of the Fed right now? My favorite thing about Bitcoin is meeting Bitcoiners in person. That's why I'm so excited to tell you guys about what is going on June 14th down in beautiful Tampa Bay, Florida. That's the Sound Money Soiree paired with Bitcoin Day. They're bringing a full day of great talks with amazing speakers like your boy here. And we're topping it off with a black tie event just for you, and bring in that hot lady friend. We had Bitcoin cross 100K. We're all getting girlfriends, folks. So come on down to beautiful Tampa, Florida. And if you use the link below, you will get 10% off your entire order. Whether you want to go to just the black tie event or black tie event plus Bitcoin Day, you'll get 10% off using the links below. Also, if you're thinking about going to BitBlock Boom in April, if you're going to Vegas in May, or if you're thinking about going to Prague in June, use my promo code Green Candle for all of those. You'll get 10% off your entire order. And come bug me. I hope to see you guys very soon at one of these great in-person events. Enough from me, back to the show.
Yeah, look, I mean, been talking about this for a year now. I mean, the Fed needs some sort of crash to be able to justify raising rates. So they are, as you suggest, diametrically opposed to what Trump's trying to achieve at this point. Yeah, it's really hard to know. I don't think that Powell will be able to hold out much longer. Obviously, we just had the rate call recently where he kept rates unchanged, but I think it's only going to deteriorate the system, the situation. So he's going to have to cut rates. Maybe he's hoping that global M2 and China have been very aggressive in easing and providing liquidity, and their own sort of stealth QE is going to help things, you know, maintain and meaning that he won't have to cut rates. But at some point, Besant wants to refinance all the debt, and that's the biggest issue. Obviously, he wants to get the rates down on the debts that are out there, because Yellen obviously left him in a very difficult situation with not taking advantage of the longer dated curve when rates were low to restructure all their debt. But now you've got a situation where China is seller of US Treasuries, even not actively, but Japan are very definitely an active seller of Treasuries because they're trying to defend the yen. So it's a really sticky wicket. And I think if you look at what happened in macro hedge funds in the last month, you know, returns are all over the place. It's a really hard market to trade. Like if you're trying to trade in the rates market and call what's going to be happening next, you're on you're on a very, very difficult ground because all of these things are very, very important factors, and it's very hard to see the way of where things are going to go. Um, the wonderful thing about being a Bitcoiner is it seems that both scenarios play out very positively for Bitcoin. But I certainly wouldn't like to be trading a macro book right now.
Yeah, dive into that because I think it's interesting because, the narrative around is all right, Bitcoin's about to start in this bull market, but this is the first bull market where the underlying macro situation is extremely hairy because it seems like, Bitcoin has almost been propped up by, global M2 money supply, which,
Mhm.
globally it's starting to increase, right? We saw the massive amounts of money printing in 2020 and 21 where we saw Bitcoin go from 4,000 to 70. And, a lot of us are kind of hoping that the same situation happens. But at the same time, we either have like an extremely large asset bubble, which I think is what Trump is trying to go for, or we see, a major crash. And either way, Bitcoin's just going to have to kind of deal with it. So, you know, how is Bitcoin going to react in all of this? Or do you see maybe people flocking to it? Yeah, describe kind of how you see maybe the traditional financial world looking at Bitcoin during this uncertain time.
Yeah, I think it's very clear, obviously, how liquidity impacts Bitcoin. That's always been the way that Bitcoin is traded. I guess what you're asking is how does it end up looking the other way around if you start CM2 getting sucked out of the system again? And I think that's something that has been happening in sort of 23, 24, right? And actually, Bitcoin performed fine because more and more people are gravitating towards it. More and more corporate treasuries are looking at it not as a risk-on asset, not corporate treasury, sorry. Governments and central banks are looking at it as not necessarily a risk-on asset. So when I talk about risk-on versus risk-off, that's liquidity-driven, right? So liquidity is growing, risk-on, take more risk, buy risk assets. So that's what's always played well for Bitcoin because it was perceived a risk asset. What you've seen in the recent 6 weeks has been a real decoupling of Bitcoin from risk assets. And I think this is the first moment people are starting to understand that as the fiat system becomes more tumultuous, then actually Bitcoin will start to behave more and more as a safe haven asset, as we've been all been saying for a long time, right? This is, to your earlier point, where we transition to. Now, that slope can be really violent and hard, or it can be slow and gradual. And I think, fortunately, it's been slow and gradual so far. I mean, I was talking to someone about it the other day, and he was saying, I really, all my time in Bitcoin, I've just hated crypto because crypto has led to so many people losing money when they shouldn't have lost money. It's led to a real distraction away from Bitcoin. But it's actually led to the point that I can buy more Bitcoin for a lower price for longer. So actually, I should be more grateful because people look at it as a risk-on asset and they haven't understood what this is. And I think that's the very valid point, and that's the key point. Actually, is understanding that this is the asset, both risk-on and risk-off. It's the asset that you want to be taking and investing in. And I think that's when markets decoupled 3-4 weeks ago, when you saw NASDAQ dropping and Bitcoin up, that I was getting calls from so many different hedge fund managers that I knew from my previous life. What is going on? You're the guy in our community that understands Bitcoin. What the hell is going on? Why is it behaving like this? What's happening? So that moment really was, in my opinion, the inflection point where you started to see people say, well, hang on a minute, this is a different asset necessarily than we understood. Because you always had that sort of, when you would talk to these hedge fund managers, yeah, it's a risk-on asset, it's correlated with the NASDAQ, that's it. That's the only way I need to think about it. And it was very easy to dismiss for them. And so, as I say, that 3-4 weeks ago, when we started to see those moments, those days of big drawdown and decoupling of Bitcoin, that was the inflection point moment where people started to really understand, okay, hang on a minute. This could be the asset that is a risk off asset as well.
So yeah,
So
you stole a little of my thunder there because I was going to ask you about the decoupling. So do you think we've fully decoupled now from the stock market, or is it did it just take that little bit just to get people more curious about Bitcoin?
yeah, I think, as I was trying to say, those few decoupling moments that we had have meant that it's impossible for a macro manager to now say, oh, it's just a risk on asset. I trade that for risk on. And that's it. It correlates with NASDAQ 100% or 97%. Like, that's not the case anymore. And a lot of people sort of got a bit of a wake up call with that.
Yeah.
So I think I'm not saying that from this point on, it completely decouples and runs away, because we're early. We're still early. And this is what I keep saying to people. We're still so early, right? And so it's just that seedling, that very early, hang on a minute, not quite what I thought it was. So it'll start to trade different. And then, as I say, you'll get this slow decorrelation from NASDAQ and risk on. But yeah, that's not going to happen overnight. We're not decorrelated now forever. Like, it's just, that's the beginning.
Yeah, and it definitely seems like that's going to be the trend, especially now when we're seeing, nation states and some of these big, corporations start to come in. And, I've been lining it out kind of, I guess, throughout this conversation, we've been talking about all the different tools used to just accumulate more Bitcoin and then essentially hold here. So it seems like, we mentioned at the beginning of this, there's a short squeeze. You mentioned that you could see us getting to 200,000 very quickly. Do you see us like just exploding here in this cycle? How do you think that this might be the potentially the last of the 4-year cycles that we see in Bitcoin?
It's again, it's the multi-million-dollar question.
Yeah.
It's, you always think this cycle is different. I remember thinking in 2021 and 2020 that this was it. No one was going to, in their right mind, be selling Bitcoin freely again. But, and now we're looking at so many corporates, nation states across the world, state of New Hampshire, obviously adopting. Like, that's going to lead to a domino effect at a state level in the United States. So you've just got so many buying points that and the thing that I do like to look at, and I know, again, there's a lot of debate about this, is exchange balances of Bitcoin dropping. If we look back to 2021, so sort of last point of the cycle where we kind of are now, exchange balances were 3.5 million. Today, depending on what numbers you believe, it's been fluctuating for a while. The numbers do change quite regularly. It's hard to find a reliable number, but now is around 2.2, 2.4 million. And you've had 1.1 million of issuance over that 4-year period. So it's very clear that liquid supply is being sucked out of the ecosystem, which obviously leads to the view about the short squeeze. But do I think that necessarily leads to the end of the 4-year cycle? If we go to 250, 500K this cycle, are we going to then see another 70% drawdown? I'd find it really hard to believe, but you can never discount it. Bitcoin always surprises me, and it's because it's so early again. If you think, I work closely with a guy you may have heard of called Willy Woo, relatively famous guy in terms of on-chain analytics, and his view is that we're at max 4% of human adoption. So we're just so early when you think about human adoption, 4%, corporate adoption, not even 1%, government adoption, not even 1%, and then AI adoption, which I think is a very real potential adoption case in the next even two years. Then you're at 0% for AI. That is, all of those have potential to explode. So can you really see a 60, 70%, 80% drawdown on the back of all that potential for demand? I can't see it, but as I say, I've been surprised before, so I'm not going to call it.
Self-custody can be a daunting task. That's why I've partnered with Bitbox. They have the best hardware wallet. They make it the easiest to put Bitcoin in self-custody. So go to bitbox.swiss/greencandle today and use promo code greencandle and you can get 5% off your entire order. They make it so easy, all in one. You could get the hardware wallet, you could get their punch plates, you could do it all right there on that website to make the self-custody experience the easiest it can be. So visit bitbox.swiss/greencandle. Use promo code greencandle, get 5% off your entire order, and get your Bitcoin off an exchange into self-custody today. All right, enough for me. Let's get back to the show. Yeah, I love Willy Woo's work, especially the multiplier effect. I talk about it a lot on this channel about the every dollar that comes in, it's about like, I think it last time I checked, it's about 6x towards the market cap of Bitcoin, which we're sitting a little bit over $2 trillion now, but still like, about 10x less than gold. Do you see a world where we start to take over gold, or at least Bitcoin starts to take over gold, as it's, I think, sitting here and recording today, the 6th largest asset on the planet currently?
I said it on the podcast that I think you were referencing earlier the other day. I think when you look at gold and you look at the inefficiency around portability, the lack of scarcity, and also the inefficiency around divisibility, it's obvious how much better Bitcoin is than gold. And I think if you can get the boomer generation over this sort of problem that they have mentally around digital versus physical, where they have to be able to see and touch something, then we are going to go immediately to $1 million Bitcoin, because that just takes you to the same market cap of gold. So, we're sitting here at 100K today buying Bitcoin at a 90% discount to what is basic fair value for it. I think it's a gift, and I continue to tell people that. But how long it takes for that generation to properly understand this, and I'm not trying to be insulting of boomers here. I mean, I've actually orange pilled a number of boomers who've really got it and have bought a lot of Bitcoin. But generally, and I'm trying to speak generally, these are the people with a ton of assets, sitting in the bond market, sitting in real estate, and they haven't understood Bitcoin, and they don't understand why it's so much better than gold. And so they might be allocating to gold, but they don't see that not only is Bitcoin a replacement for gold, but it's a replacement for your fixed income, for your real estate, all of these allocations. So they'll get there eventually. We've obviously got a huge shift in assets coming with generational handover. And so I think that's going to take, the next 10 years or so, but that will all be beneficial to Bitcoin as well.
Yeah, 100%. I think, all of this the adoption that's starting to roll in is just going to be continued and more, beneficial to Bitcoin. But I think the interesting aspect of what I see is potentially people moving from gold into Bitcoin. So essentially the rise of Bitcoin could essentially crash gold. Do you see it playing that way, or do you think there's always going to be some sort of room for gold?
I think we've seen it, right? That central banks are hoarding gold in this environment of, heightened concern about the viability of the US dollar. So, that's not going to change anytime soon. I can't imagine China or India turning around and saying we're going to start selling our gold to buy Bitcoin. I just don't think that's going to happen. I think you'll see maybe a 1 to 5% allocation from them, and that will be new purchasing rather than selling gold. you might see a bit of selling gold from the US. In this, these are some of the ideas that have been floated around budget neutral Bitcoin. But I don't think that they would do that in a disorderly fashion. Obviously they want to make sure that they protect such a core holding that they have and don't fire sale it. So I can't see that happening. Having worked in markets for as long as I have and seeing the way that people can trade things in order to not impact price when they're trying to get stuff done, I would be fairly confident that the US would have some very good advice when liquidating the gold.
Now, you mentioned the sovereigns earlier, where you're like, you don't really know what the sovereigns are doing. And I want to, I guess, kind of pivot that into the United States. Do you think that there's a world where the US government and, entities in like the major, I don't know, 3-letter indices in the US could be potentially starting to stack Bitcoin and they just wouldn't announce it? Or do you not see that as ever a possibility?
Yeah, I talked about this recently. Like, I think that the US has less Bitcoin than China. And this is why we haven't heard from the US about how much Bitcoin they actually hold. And I think that they want to get to a point where they've got back above the amount of Bitcoin that China hold, which is around the 200,000 level, if I remember correctly. Because the US have a stated obligation to provide the hacked Bitcoin from Bitfinex back to them, which I think is about 70 or 90,000 Bitcoin. So that's a big chunk of the US's Bitcoin holdings. So my view is that they want to reaccumulate, get back above China again before announcing anything. But I don't, if you're trying to accumulate something with as big as a ticket as the US potentially are, you really don't want the market knowing about it. So I would suggest that they really will not be announcing anything anytime soon.
Yeah, it's interesting because China has, I guess, like come out and said that they were going to sell all of that seized Bitcoin, but then, outside of like a couple headlines here or there, I don't think that they really ended up doing it, or at least there was no on-chain evidence of that going on. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting to see this nation state, I guess, race to stack as much Bitcoin start to play out. But you mentioned that the US and some of these other big entities would be almost, irresponsible to announce to the world that they are stacking. So do you think that there's already several nation states starting to stack and just being quiet about it? Maybe Russia mining Bitcoin or doing something along those lines already kind of starting to play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned at the beginning that I'm an advisor to Jan 3, so I work with Samson quite closely, and I'm aware of obviously everything he's doing. Like, there are nation states buying Bitcoin. We are definitely aware of some, and I think there are certainly others that are very, very private about it. So yeah,
Yeah.
I would definitely say so. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll have like more potentially Kingdom of Bhutan's type of aspect, or are there bigger players that are here that are stacking Bitcoin?
There are some big players. Yeah.
All right. Oh, well, now we're getting super bullish here with all of this going on. But with this,
I'll maybe just temper your bullishness. There are some very big nations, but they are not making, or that I'm aware of, huge purchases at this point. They're
okay.
very, very small purchases for the sort of money that they control.
All right. Well, can you define small for me? All
Yeah, a
right.
few hundreds of millions.
Okay. Well, hey, that still seems like a big chunk of change to the average pleb out there, right? I mean, I think the difference in this
Yeah,
cycle is we're seeing, nation states, corporates come in and, even comparatively to last cycle, where we saw MicroStrategy and Michael Saylor come in, his first buy he came in was like 250 million. GameStop came in, and that's their first buy or whatever they're raising. I think it was like $1.3 billion. That's, still like 5-6x more than what MSTR originally raised to do that. So I think that the orders of magnitude of money coming in is just all underlying for what you are lining out here of this short squeeze. But you've been very generous with your time, and you have a great podcast yourself. So why don't you tell people a little bit about what you got going on and where they can find you?
Well, thanks, Brandon. Yeah, so I host a podcast called Seize the Future, SYZ, the Future. We're on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. We talk, it's quite an interesting podcast for Bitcoiners because I get on experts from every aspect of issues within the world. So, things like geopolitics, energy security, climate change, these types of things. And then when we go through it and we talk about where solutions probably lie, I'll always ask the guest how they're allocating capital. And I think every single guest, bar two, so 20%, we've only done 10 podcasts or 11 podcasts now, have said in some way, shape, or form Bitcoin, which is very interesting because these are not necessarily Bitcoiners. These are, really wide variety experts, but obviously people that think about the world, think about what's changing in the world. And I think this is why it's so interesting to talk to people like that and then have them understanding Bitcoin. This is, obviously it's great to talk to Bitcoiners on a podcast and real pure play Bitcoiners. But when you're speaking to someone that is involved at the various highest level of, negotiation of geopolitics, and they're talking about Bitcoin, like it's pretty interesting the way the world's moving. So yeah,
100%.
seize the future. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll put all that in the show notes. And I definitely think, the way that just money management is going, if you consider yourself a fiduciary, it would be against your fiduciary responsibility to not hold Bitcoin for your clients, and MSTR for that aspect as well, just because of how well it's performing. But you've been very generous with your time. I think everybody should go check out your podcast, Seize the Future. And Richard, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Brandon. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to the latest episode of the State of Bitcoin podcast. If you really enjoyed this one, I've got another one cooking up for you. You can click that right here and you can go to the next episode, which is an absolute banger where I'm bringing you only the latest and greatest guests. Or if you're looking for more macro related content, you could check out my other channel, Macro Insights Pod. I got it linked for you right here. So where I'm bringing you more about stocks, real estate, traditional finance stuff. So go ahead and check that out. And if you enjoyed this podcast, go ahead and hit that like, hit that subscribe button, and tell a friend to tell a friend. All right, enough from me. I'll see you at the next one.